There was a city in North America that was larger than London, not in 1800, not after the Industrial Revolution, before any of that, before the Mayflower, before Columbus, before any European had set foot on this continent and written it down in a language that would survive. There was a city, there were roads, there were trade networks stretching thousands of miles, there were political systems sophisticated enough to prevent wars that should have torn entire nations apart. There were engineers who moved Earth on a scale that still baffles modern researchers. There were astronomers who tracked the sky with precision. There were farmers who fed hundreds of thousands of people across landscapes that Europeans would later call wilderness and assume had always been empty. When the first French explorers pushed into the interior of what would become Canada, they did not find a land untouched by human civilization. They found the ruins and the living remnants of something that had already peaked, and in many places already partially collapsed. They found a world that had been organized, managed, and shaped by human intelligence for thousands of years. And what they found terrified them, not always in the way we mean terror now. Sometimes it was the terror of awe. Sometimes it was the terror of realizing that the story they had told themselves about these lands, about the people in them, about what civilization looked like, was wrong, subscribe now, because what you're about to hear is not taught in schools. It is not in the textbooks that most Canadians grew up reading. It has been buried, dismissed, minimized, and in some cases actively suppressed, but it is real. The evidence is in the ground. It is in the oral traditions that survive centuries of attempts to erase them. It is in the genetic record. It is in the trade goods found thousands of miles from where they were made. It is in the earthworks so large they can be seen from the sky. It is in the political philosophy that some historians now believe influenced the founding documents of modern democracy. This is the story of what was here before, and it is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the human species. Number 1, the scale of what has been lost. Before we can understand what these civilizations were, we need to understand how completely the knowledge of them was buried. And to understand that, we need to start with a number, 90%. That is the low estimate for the population collapse of indigenous peoples in North America following European contact. Some researchers put it higher. Some say 95%. Some, examining specific regions and specific disease events, say higher still. Think about what that means. It means that for every 20 people alive in North America before contact, somewhere between 2 and 1 survived. The other 18 died. Most of them died within a few generations. Most of them died of diseases that moved faster than European settlers did, so that when the explorers arrived and found empty lands and abandoned villages and collapsed political structures, they were not seeing a land that had always been this way. They were seeing a landscape in the aftermath of a catastrophe so total that it had no equivalent in recorded human history. When Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence in 1534, he encountered large, organized settlements. He described meeting with leaders of real political authority. He described towns. He described agriculture. When Samuel de Champlain traveled the same waters less than a century later, those towns were gone. The Stadacona and Hochelagan peoples who had met Cartier had vanished or collapsed beyond recognition. The conventional explanation for a long time was migration. Scholars suggested these peoples had simply moved. But the more uncomfortable and more accurate answer, the one that the evidence now supports, is disease. The epidemics hit the interior of the continent before systematic European settlement did. They moved along trade routes. They moved faster than any European traveler, and they killed populations that had no immunity to the pathogens being introduced. What this means for history is profound. It means that the Europeans who came to settle did not encounter intact civilizations in most of the territory they moved through. They encountered the ruins of civilizations. They encountered survivor populations trying to reorganize after unimaginable loss. They encountered political vacuums where there had previously been complex governance, and they interpreted all of this not as aftermath, but as original condition. They looked at a landscape devastated by plague and called it wilderness. They looked at people shattered by catastrophic population loss and called them primitive. They wrote books and sent reports home describing a continent that had never been organized by human intelligence, never been farmed at scale, never been politically sophisticated. And those books and those reports became the foundation of how Canada understood its own history for the next 400 years. The erasure was not only physical, it was intellectual. It was written into the very frameworks that Europeans used to understand what they were seeing. They could not recognize what they found because the categories they were using were not designed to recognize it. Number 2, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the invention of modern democracy. Here is a claim that will sound extraordinary until you examine the evidence for it. And then it will sound like one of the most important facts in the history of Western political thought. The political system created by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the alliance of nations that Europeans called the Iroquois, may have been a direct model for the democratic structures embedded in the United States Constitution. And if that is true, it means that the foundational document of modern liberal democracy was partly inspired by indigenous political philosophy developed on this continent centuries before Europeans arrived. The Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, the Guyana-Shagawa, is one of the oldest living constitutional documents in the world. Scholars debate its exact age, but the oral tradition and some historical evidence suggest it was established somewhere between the 12th and 15th centuries, with some researchers arguing for even earlier origins. It governed the relationship between the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca nations, later joined by the Tuscarora in the early 18th century, as a federal union with specific rules for collective decision-making, individual rights protections, and the division of political authority. The structure was sophisticated in ways that continue to impress political scientists. There was a bicameral council system in which different nations had different voting weights. There was a process for resolving disputes between member nations. There was a mechanism for impeaching leaders who abused their authority. There was a recognition of the rights of women as the selectors of male leaders, which meant that political power was constrained in a way that had no equivalent in contemporary European governance. There were rules about the conduct of war. There were rules about the conditions under which war could be declared. There were protections for conquered peoples. Benjamin Franklin attended conferences between colonial governments and Haudenosaunee leaders. He wrote extensively about the Iroquois system of government. He explicitly praised their model of federal union as something the colonies should emulate. His 1754 Albany Plan of Union, which was the first serious proposal for a unified colonial government, echoed the structure of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in significant ways. The debates that produced the Constitution a generation later involved men who had read Franklin, who had attended conferences with Haudenosaunee representatives, who were familiar with this system of government. The formal acknowledgement of this connection came in 1988, when the United States Congress passed a resolution recognizing the contribution of the Iroquois Confederacy to the development of the American Constitution. It is not fringe theory. It is documented influence. It is recorded in the letters and journals of the founders themselves. But here is what often gets lost in that story. The Great Law of Peace was not created in response to European contact. It was not a system developed after Europeans arrived. It was a system that had been functioning, evolving, and governing for centuries before any Europeans saw it. The political genius encoded in that system was developed entirely independently on this continent by indigenous thinkers responding to the problem that all political thinkers eventually face, which is how to organize human beings into cooperative groups, large enough to accomplish great things without allowing any one person or faction to accumulate enough power to destroy the whole project. That problem is hard. It took Europe most of recorded history to develop imperfect answers to it. The Haudenosaunee developed a remarkably sophisticated answer centuries before contact, and it worked. The Confederacy prevented wars between nations that had previously fought each other. It created a zone of relative peace and stability across a significant portion of northeastern North America. It lasted, it adapted, it survived, and it was so evidently effective that some of the most careful political thinkers in early America looked at it and said, that is what we should build. Number 3, the Mississippian world and the city that was larger than London. Most of what follows concerns what is now Canada, but to understand the civilizations of pre-contact Canada, you must first understand the world they were connected to, and that world stretched south across the continent and included a city that most people have never heard of, a city called Cahokia. Cahokia was built on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, roughly where St. Louis, Missouri stands today. At its peak, around the year 1100, it had a population estimated between 10,000 and 20,000 people. Some estimates go higher. Whatever the precise number, it was one of the largest cities in the world at that time. It was larger than London. It was larger than Paris. It was a city of substantial wooden structures built on raised platforms, of plazas designed for mass public ceremonies, of markets where goods from across the continent were exchanged. At the center of Cahokia stood Monk's Mound, an earthwork platform so massive that it contains more material by volume than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built in stages over centuries, each generation of builders adding to the work of the previous one, creating a structure that covered 14 acres at its base and rose 30 meters into the air. At the top of this mound stood a large wooden building. Below it, the city spread for miles. Cahokia was not an isolated phenomenon. It was the center of a culture and a trade network that extended across most of the eastern half of North America. Cahokian influence, measured in the spread of distinctive artistic styles, ceremonial objects, and architectural forms, reached into what is now southern Ontario and the Canadian Shield regions. Copper mined in the Lake Superior region moved south to Cahokia. Ideas moved north. Trade moved in both directions. The peoples living in what would become Canada were not isolated villagers. They were participants in a continental system. The city collapsed, or more precisely declined, over several centuries before European contact. The reasons remain debated. Possible factors include environmental degradation, deforestation, agricultural soil depletion, political instability, and climate shifts associated with the medieval warm period ending. Whatever the causes, by the time Europeans arrived, Cahokia was ruins being reclaimed by vegetation. But its influence had shaped cultures across the continent, including cultures in the territory that would become Canada for centuries. Understanding Cahokia matters for understanding Canada because it explodes the foundational myth that the pre-contact Americas were populated by scattered, unconnected, politically simple peoples. Cahokia demonstrates that North America had produced genuine urban civilization. It had produced complexity. It had produced a world in which cities existed, trade networks functioned, political authority was exercised, and cultural ideas spread across vast distances. Canada was part of that world. Number 4, the mound builders of the North. When people think of ancient earthworks in North America, they tend to think of the American Southeast and Midwest. But significant mound-building cultures existed well into what is now Canada, and what they left behind challenges every assumption about what was possible in the pre-contact North. In the Rainy River region of northwestern Ontario, along the border with Minnesota, there is a complex of burial mounds that represents the northernmost extension of a mound-building tradition that stretched across the continent. These mounds were not simple piles of dirt. They were constructed with specific orientation toward astronomical events. They contained burials that revealed elaborate social stratification, with some individuals interred with enormous quantities of prestige goods and others buried with nothing. They were organized in spatial relationships to each other that suggest deliberate planning across generations. The people who built these mounds were not isolated. Analysis of the goods found within them reveals connections to trade networks, extending south to the Gulf of Mexico and west to the Rocky Mountains. Copper from Lake Superior appears in mounds far to the south. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast appear in mounds in Ontario. Mica from the Appalachians, obsidian from Yellowstone, galena from the Illinois region. These were not chance encounters. This was systematic trade across thousands of miles, maintained over centuries, requiring sophisticated social organization to sustain. In the region of southern Ontario, a different but equally significant expression of pre-contact complexity developed in the centuries before European arrival. The Huron-Wendat Confederacy, the Wendat, built settlements that European observers would later describe with unmistakable surprise as towns. Not villages, not camps. Towns with populations in the thousands, with longhouses that housed multiple families, with palisade walls, with cleared agricultural fields extending for miles around them. At its height, the Wendat Confederacy consisted of roughly 25 to 30,000 people, organized into perhaps 25 to 30 communities. The individual communities ranged in size from a few hundred to several thousand inhabitants. The largest were genuine towns by any reasonable definition. They had governance structures, ceremonial life, agricultural systems capable of producing significant food surpluses, and trade networks connecting them to peoples across the continent. When Champlain encountered the Wendat in the early 17th century, he described their largest settlement, Cahiag, as having 200 longhouses. At perhaps 8 to 10 people per longhouse on average, that single settlement held somewhere between 1,600 and 2,000 people, and it was one of many such settlements in a confederacy that governed itself according to rules, complex enough to negotiate alliances, settle disputes, and organize military campaigns involving thousands of warriors. The mounds of the Rainy River region and the towns of the Wendat Confederacy are expressions of the same underlying reality. The peoples of pre-contact Canada were not primitive. They were not simple. They were not wilderness wanderers without political sophistication or material ambition. They were builders of complex societies adapted to their environments with extraordinary ingenuity. Number 5, the salmon civilization of the Pacific Northwest. On the opposite side of the continent, in the river systems and coastal zones of what would become British Columbia, a different kind of complexity had developed. And it was a kind of complexity that defied one of the most basic assumptions of Western anthropology, which was that civilization requires agriculture. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest, including the Haida, Tlingit, Tsimshian, Kwakwaka'wakw, Nuu-chah-nulth, Coast Salish, and others, had developed permanent villages, hierarchical social structures, sophisticated art traditions, complex ceremonial systems, large-scale construction projects, and long-distance trade networks without practicing agriculture in the conventional sense. Their civilization was built on fish, specifically on salmon. The salmon runs of the Pacific Northwest rivers were, and in diminished form remain, one of the most extraordinary biological events on the planet. Millions of fish, returning from the ocean to spawn in the same river systems year after year, provided a predictable, harvestable surplus of protein that could be dried, smoked, and stored for year-round consumption. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed sophisticated technology for harvesting this resource at scale, including weirs, traps, and nets capable of capturing thousands of fish at once, as well as preservation techniques that allowed the catch to be stored through the winter. The result was exactly what happens in any society that develops a reliable food surplus. People could specialize. Not everyone had to spend all their time getting food. Some people could become full-time carpenters who built the enormous longhouses that housed extended families of dozens. Some could become full-time artists who created the elaborate carvings, weavings, and decorative works that marked Pacific Northwest cultures. Some could become full-time specialists in the knowledge systems, the oral traditions, the legal codes, the diplomatic protocols that organize social life. The longhouses themselves were extraordinary structures, built from cedar logs and planks. They ranged from 30 to over 60 meters in length. They housed extended family groups of 20 to 60 or more people. The interior space was organized with sophisticated attention to social hierarchy and household function. The exterior displayed carved and painted imagery that served as a kind of public record, announcing the ancestry, status, and spiritual relationships of the family within. The totem poles that became icons of Pacific Northwest culture were not decorative, they were documentary. They recorded family histories, commemorated important events, and announced social claims in a visual language legible to anyone who knew how to read it. The carving traditions that produced them represented accumulated knowledge of materials, tools, and artistic conventions passed down through generations of specialist training. These were not folk crafts, they were high art produced by dedicated practitioners within a system that valued and supported that specialization. The potlatch ceremony, the great redistributive feast that bound Pacific Northwest societies together, was a political institution as much as a cultural one. At potlatches, leaders demonstrated their status not by accumulating wealth, but by distributing it. The host who could give away the most was the host who demonstrated the greatest power. This system of competitive generosity created a mechanism for wealth redistribution that prevented the extreme concentration of resources at the top of the social hierarchy, while reinforcing the social bonds that held communities together. When European traders and explorers arrived on the Pacific coast, they encountered peoples who lived in what appeared to them to be large, permanent, well-organized communities, who possessed artistic traditions of extraordinary sophistication, whose political systems were clearly complex, even if their logic was not immediately legible to European eyes, and whose confidence in engaging with outsiders was the confidence of people who had been doing international trade for a very long time. The maritime trade networks of the Pacific Northwest extended far out into the ocean and up and down the coast over vast distances. These were not isolated peoples having their first encounter with a larger world. They were experienced participants in a world that was already large. Number 6. The agricultural revolution in the North. The conventional story holds that agriculture in North America was primarily a phenomenon of the warm South, and that the peoples of the Canadian interior and North lived by hunting and gathering because the climate made farming impossible. This story is partly true and almost entirely misleading. It is true that the climate of most of Canada limited the kinds of crops that could be grown and the scale at which they could be grown. It is not true that the peoples of pre-contact Canada were passive recipients of whatever the land produced without modification. The agricultural revolution in what would become Canada was real, widespread, and sophisticated. It was just different from what European observers were trained to recognize as agriculture. In southern Ontario, the Wendat and their predecessors practiced a form of agriculture centered on what is sometimes called the Three Sisters, the companion planting of corn, beans, and squash in a system that modern agricultural scientists have recognized as remarkably effective. The corn provided vertical structure. The beans climbed the corn stalks and fixed nitrogen in the soil. The squash spread along the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining moisture. The three crops together produced a more reliable, more nutritious, and more sustainable harvest than any of them alone. The agricultural fields around Wendat towns were not small gardens. They were extensive cleared areas, sometimes stretching for several kilometers around a settlement, capable of producing substantial surpluses. When European observers first encountered these systems, they recognized them as agriculture because they matched something close enough to European patterns to be legible, but they consistently underestimated the scale and sophistication of what they were seeing. The Wendat and their agricultural neighbors did not simply plant crops in fixed fields. They practiced a form of shifting cultivation that allowed agricultural land to rest and recover. They moved their settlements periodically, typically every 10 to 15 years, when the surrounding land had been sufficiently depleted that productivity dropped below acceptable levels. This was not the rootless wandering that Europeans sometimes described it as. It was a sophisticated land management strategy that maintained productivity over the long term by giving the land time to recover. In the eastern woodlands more broadly, indigenous peoples had been systematically shaping the landscape for centuries before European arrival. The use of fire as a land management tool transformed vast areas from dense forest to the open parkland and savanna that European explorers would later describe as if it were natural wilderness. These burns were not accidental or careless. They were systematic. They maintained the open habitats that supported the deer and other game animals that supplemented the agricultural diet. They promoted the growth of berry bushes and other food plants. They cleared travel corridors. They created the defensive buffer zones around settlements that made surprise attack more difficult. When Europeans walked through the open, park-like forests of what would become Ontario, they were walking through a managed landscape. The trees were spaced the way they were because generations of indigenous land managers had shaped them. The clearings were there because generations of deliberate burning had maintained them. The game was there in the numbers it was because generations of careful management had maintained the habitat. What Europeans called wilderness was in fact a garden, a continental garden managed over centuries with tools and techniques that left few traces legible to people trained to look for European-style agriculture. Number 7, the trade network that connected a continent. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence for the sophistication of pre-contact North American civilization is not a monument or a city. It is an object. A small object, easily overlooked, found far from where it was made. A copper ornament found in a burial mound in Ontario, made from copper mined on the shore of Lake Superior, appeared in a burial context alongside a conch shell from the Gulf of Mexico and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. The person in that burial lived, perhaps, in what is now southwestern Ontario. In their lifetime or the lifetimes of people they knew, goods had traveled from the Gulf Coast, from the mountains of the American Southeast, and from the shores of Lake Superior, to end up together in that single grave. This is not an isolated find. Across North America, researchers have documented the systematic movement of specific materials over specific trade routes across thousands of miles. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region in Wyoming appears in sites in Ohio. Gulf Coast marine shells appear in sites in Manitoba. Pacific Ocean shells appear in sites in the Great Plains. Lake Superior copper, the most intensively traded commodity in pre-contact North America, appears in sites from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Hudson Bay watershed. The movement of these goods required networks. It required relationships. It required protocols for exchange, mechanisms for resolving disputes, shared languages or diplomatic traditions that allowed strangers to conduct business. It required the accumulation and transmission of geographical knowledge, of knowledge about routes and distances and the peoples living along them, that could only be maintained through continuous use over generations. The Wendat Confederacy, at the time of European contact, was the center of one of the most active trading systems in North America. Their position at the north shore of Lake Ontario and the eastern shore of Georgian Bay placed them at the intersection of multiple trade routes. Corn, dried fish, tobacco, furs, and various manufactured goods moved through Wendat communities in both directions. The Wendat acted, in modern economic terms, as middlemen in a continental trading system, accumulating surplus from their productive agricultural base and exchanging it for goods produced by peoples less suited to that kind of agriculture. When French traders arrived and offered European goods, the Wendat did not respond as people encountering trade for the first time. They responded as experienced traders who recognized new inventory. They evaluated the new goods, iron tools, copper kettles, glass beads, with the sophisticated judgment of people who had been assessing the quality and value of trade goods for generations. They negotiated, they set terms, they leveraged their existing trade relationships to control access to the interior. They were not novices being introduced to commerce by Europeans. They were experienced commercial actors incorporating new suppliers into an existing system. The scale and sophistication of pre-contact North American trade has been obscured by the same forces that obscured everything else about pre-contact civilization. Population collapse, disrupted trade networks that required continuous human maintenance. The goods that moved through these networks were mostly perishable, food and textiles, and things that do not survive in the archaeological record. The copper and shell and stone that do survive give us only a glimpse of systems that were far more extensive and complex than the surviving evidence can fully reconstruct. But that glimpse is enough to make clear that the peoples of pre-contact Canada were not isolated communities scratching out survival in disconnected corners of a vast wilderness. They were participants in a continental economy. They were connected to each other and to peoples across the continent through relationships of exchange that had been maintained for centuries and that shaped every aspect of their social and political lives. Number 8. The knowledge systems that mapped the world. Before European contact, there were no written maps of North America in the European sense. There were no printed charts, no surveyed coastlines, no measured distances recorded in portable documents that could be consulted away from the landscape they described. What there was something far more comprehensive and in some ways far more sophisticated. There was a living knowledge system distributed across human minds and encoded in oral tradition, ceremony, song, and story that contained detailed and accurate geographical information about the entire continent. When European explorers pushed into the interior of North America, they were almost entirely dependent on indigenous guides, not just for companionship or labor, but for the knowledge that made travel possible. The guides knew the rivers, they knew the portages, they knew the seasonal variations in water levels, they knew where the rapids were dangerous and where they could be navigated safely. They knew which routes were controlled by which nations and what the current state of political relations meant for who could travel safely where. They knew the landmarks. They knew the distances. This was not trivial knowledge. Navigating the interior of North America by canoe requires mastery of a hydrological system of staggering complexity. The Canadian Shield alone contains hundreds of thousands of lakes connected by rivers and streams in patterns that are not intuitively obvious from the ground. To travel through it efficiently and safely, you need information that can only be accumulated through generations of experience. You need to know that this river connects to that lake, which connects to that other river, which, if you follow it past the third set of rapids and portage to the left, eventually leads to the bay you are trying to reach. The indigenous peoples of the Canadian interior had that knowledge. They had accumulated it over thousands of years of living in and moving through the landscape. They encoded it in oral tradition in forms that could be transmitted accurately across generations. They encoded it in the roots of seasonal movement that were themselves a form of geographical knowledge, a living map traced year after year across the same landscape by the feet and canoes of people who knew exactly where they were going. When Samuel de Champlain produced his famous maps of New France, the most accurate maps of the North American interior produced by any European for more than a century, he was drawing on information provided by indigenous informants and guides. His maps were good because his sources were good. The knowledge that made those maps possible was not European. It was indigenous. It was the product of thousands of years of careful observation and systematic knowledge transmission in a continent that Europeans were only beginning to enter. The astronomical knowledge encoded in indigenous traditions across North America adds another dimension to this picture. The Ojibwe star knowledge system, for example, contained detailed information about the movements of celestial bodies accumulated over centuries of careful observation. The orientation of certain ceremonial structures towards specific astronomical events, the solstices, the equinoxes, the rising and setting points of specific stars, demonstrates that indigenous peoples across the continent were conducting systematic observations of the sky and encoding what they found in ways that could be transmitted across generations. This was not primitive stargazing. It was the foundation of a calendar system, a navigational system, and a framework for understanding seasonal change that was precisely calibrated to the specific environment in which it was developed. The knowledge of when to plant, when to harvest, when to move camp, when the salmon would run, when the caribou would migrate, was astronomical knowledge encoded in story and ceremony. It was science in a different form, but it was science. It was careful observation, systematic recording, and practical application of accumulated knowledge. It just did not look like European science, and European observers generally did not recognize it as such. Number 9. The Anishinaabe world and the Great Lakes civilization. The Great Lakes region is one of the most significant geographical features of North America. The lakes contain roughly 20% of the world's surface fresh water. The rivers and streams connecting and draining from them create a hydrological network of extraordinary productivity. The climate moderated by the lakes supports diverse ecosystems capable of feeding large human populations. Before European contact, this region was home to some of the most sophisticated and densely populated civilizations in northern North America. The Anishinaabe peoples, the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Ottawa, and related nations inhabited the region surrounding Lakes Huron, Superior, and Michigan for thousands of years before European contact. Their oral tradition and their clan system preserve detailed knowledge of this history, including knowledge of a period of significant political and territorial reorganization that occurred centuries before European arrival, the Great Migration, in which Anishinaabe peoples moved from the eastern coast of North America westward along a route marked by specific geographical landmarks that the oral tradition describes with remarkable geographical precision. The Anishinaabe clan system, the Duodam, organized social life in ways that served multiple functions simultaneously. Clans regulated marriage, preventing the genetic problems that come from close kin mating, by requiring that people marry outside their clan. Clans assign specific social responsibilities to specific groups, with the Crane and Loon clans responsible for leadership and diplomacy, the Bear clan responsible for internal security and policing, the Fish clan responsible for intellectual and spiritual leadership, the Bird clans for spiritual matters, and the Deer clans for matters of sustenance and physical welfare. This was a division of social labor institutionalized in a form that distributed responsibility across the community and created a system of mutual dependence that was also a system of mutual accountability. The seasonal round of Anishinaabe life has sometimes been described as nomadic, as if it were wandering without purpose or pattern. It was neither. The seasonal movements of Anishinaabe families and communities followed routes that had been refined over generations, moving between specific locations at specific times in a carefully choreographed cycle that maximized access to resources while managing those resources sustainably over the long term. Winter hunting grounds, spring sugar bush camps, summer fishing sites, fall rice, harvesting areas, each stop in the cycle was a known location, a named place with specific significance in the community's relationship with the landscape. Wild rice, manuman, deserves special attention in this context because it was a staple food of such importance to the Anishinaabe that it shaped the entire geography of their civilization. Wild rice grows in the shallow lakes and rivers of the Canadian Shield and the northern Great Lakes region. It is extraordinarily nutritious, capable of being dried and stored for extended periods, and reliably productive in appropriate habitat. The Anishinaabe managed wild rice stands with the same deliberate care that agricultural peoples elsewhere applied to their fields. They seeded new areas. They protected productive stands. They harvested in ways designed to ensure continued production. They moved their settlements to maintain access to productive harvesting areas. This was agriculture in a meaningful sense, even though it was not recognized as such by European observers who were looking for plowed fields and domestic animals. The intentional management of wild rice stands for sustained production was a form of food production as systematic and as sophisticated as any European farming practice, and it supported populations that were larger, better nourished, and in many measurable ways healthier than the European peasants who would eventually replace them. Number 10. The first encounter and the terror of recognition. When European explorers and settlers first encountered the peoples of what would become Canada, their reactions were more complex than the simple story of superior, meeting inferior that colonial history would later construct. The accounts of early contact, read carefully, reveal something much more interesting. They reveal surprise. They reveal respect, sometimes grudging, sometimes genuine. They reveal, in some cases, something that can only be described as fear. The fear was not, for the most part, fear of primitive savagery. The terror that the first settlers described was not the terror of encountering people who were less than them. It was sometimes, and this is the part that gets edited out of the conventional history, the terror of encountering people who were in specific ways more than them, more capable, more knowledgeable, more sophisticated in their management of the specific world they both now occupied. Jacques Cartier's account of his first meetings with the Haudenosaunee people he encountered on the St. Lawrence in 1534 is worth reading carefully. He described being met by organized groups in canoes. He described leaders who exercised clear authority over their followers. He described people who had a clear sense of territorial rights and who were not shy about asserting them. He described people who had clearly dealt with outsiders before and who had developed protocols for managing those interactions. He was not encountering innocents who had never seen a stranger. He was encountering diplomats who knew exactly what they were doing. Samuel de Champlain, who came later and pushed deeper into the interior, left accounts that are even more revealing. He described the Wendat towns he visited with the unmistakable tone of someone who expected to find primitive camps and found something else. He described longhouses that were large enough to impress him. He described political deliberations that were sophisticated enough to require his attention and his best diplomatic skills. He described agricultural landscapes that were productive enough to support populations that surprised him. And he described military capability that was formidable enough that he felt it necessary to ally himself with the Wendat and their Algonquin neighbors if he wanted to survive in this territory. The alliances that Champlain built with indigenous peoples were not charity extended to weaker peoples. They were political calculations made by a man who recognized that he was operating in a world where indigenous nations held all the real power, and where his own survival and the survival of the small French settlements he was building depended entirely on maintaining good relations with peoples who could, if they chose, wipe out every French presence on the continent without significant difficulty. This is a truth that colonial history consistently obscures. The European settlers of early Canada were not conquerors walking into a power vacuum. They were guests, sometimes welcomed and sometimes not, in a world controlled by peoples who did not need them and who extended access and protection to them for their own political and economic reasons. The fur trade that became the economic foundation of New France existed because indigenous peoples chose to participate in it. They could have refused. They could have expelled the French. That they did not was not because they lacked the power to do so. It was because they calculated, not always correctly, as it would turn out, that the relationship was advantageous. The terror of recognition runs through the early accounts in another form as well. Many of the first Europeans to spend extended time among indigenous peoples came back changed. Some came back and reported that the peoples they had lived with had political and social systems that were in some ways superior to European ones. Some came back and were accused of having gone native, a phrase that itself encodes the panic of European society about the attractive force of indigenous ways of life. The fear was not only that indigenous peoples were different, it was that some Europeans would look at the difference and prefer what they saw on the other side. Number 11. The architectural achievement of the longhouse tradition. To understand the longhouse is to understand an entire philosophy of how human beings should organize their lives together. It is to understand a building that was not only a shelter, but a social institution, a political unit, a spiritual environment, and an architectural achievement that should command more respect than it typically receives in the history of world architecture. The longhouses of the Haudenosaunee and Wendat peoples were the dominant architectural form of the eastern Canadian interior for centuries before European contact. At their largest, they were structures over 60 meters in length, built from curved poles of young trees bent into an arch and covered with sheets of bark. Inside, a central corridor ran the full length of the building, with individual family compartments arranged on both sides. Each family had its own fire, shared with the family directly opposite on the other side of the corridor. Each family had its own sleeping platforms above and storage space below. The engineering of these structures was sophisticated. The curved roof shed snow and rain efficiently. The bark covering was an excellent insulator in both winter and summer. The placement of smoke holes at intervals along the ridgeline was calibrated to maintain acceptable air quality inside, while the multiple fires burned. The overall design was optimized for its specific climate and the specific social arrangements of the people who lived in it, as longhouses are structured around matrilineal family groups, with women controlling the building and the domestic space within it. Multiple longhouses in a single settlement were organized within a palisade wall that served both defensive and social functions. The palisade was typically constructed in multiple layers, with a space between layers that could be used for defensive purposes. It defined the boundary between the community and the outside world. It regulated access to the settlement, and it required collective labor to build and maintain, which meant that the act of building and maintaining the palisade was itself a community bonding activity. The decision of where to build, how long to stay, and when to move the settlement was made collectively through the same deliberative processes that governed Haudenosaunee and Wendat, political life generally. When a settlement was moved, typically every 10 to 15 years, as the surrounding agricultural land became depleted, the community moved together. The knowledge of how to build, how to manage the land around the new settlement, how to establish productive agricultural fields was carried in the minds of the people who moved. What strikes modern observers who study these structures carefully is the degree to which the longhouse was designed for communal life in a way that European domestic architecture of the same period was not. European peasants lived in individual family units that were economically self-contained and socially relatively isolated. The longhouse created a domestic unit of 10 to 20 families, 50 to 100 or more people, living in a space that required constant negotiation, cooperation, and shared management. The political skills that made the Haudenosaunee Confederacy possible were practiced and refined every day in the domestic politics of the longhouse. When the first European observers described what they saw and sent those descriptions back to Europe, the longhouse tradition registered as something surprising. It was too large to be dismissed as primitive shelter. It was too organized to be described as random. It was too clearly a deliberate architectural response to a specific way of living to be called accidental. The best European observers recognized it as what it was, an architectural tradition, a design tradition that represented a specific and sophisticated answer to the question of how human beings should live together. Number 12, the political philosophy of consensus. In European political traditions of the 15th and 16th centuries, political authority worked primarily through hierarchy and command. Kings ruled by divine right. Nobles ruled their territories with near absolute authority over the people within them. The church provided an additional layer of authority that reinforced the hierarchical order. Political decisions were made by those at the top of the hierarchy and enforced downward through chains of command, backed ultimately by the threat of violence. The political systems of most indigenous Canadian nations worked on an entirely different principle. They worked on consensus, not the modern bureaucratic notion of consensus as a compromise reached through negotiation between parties who each retained power independent of the process. Real consensus, in the sense that a decision was not made until it was genuinely accepted by all the relevant parties, not a majority, all. This distinction is more important than it might initially appear. Consensus-based political systems are not simply slower versions of majority-rule democracy. They embed a fundamentally different theory of political authority. In a majority-rule system, political authority is something that exists independently of the people being governed, and that can be transferred from a minority to a majority through the mechanism of voting. In a consensus system, political authority exists only insofar as it is actively accepted by everyone it claims to govern. A leader who cannot achieve consensus has no authority, not diminished authority, no authority. Among the Haudenosaunee, the deliberative process for reaching consensus on important matters could take days or weeks. Representatives of different clans and nations would speak in turn. The protocol for who spoke when, in what order, with what forms of acknowledgement from others, was elaborate and carefully maintained. The goal was not to find out what the majority wanted. The goal was to find a path that everyone could accept. This required, and here is where the political genius becomes most visible, that the process itself be more valuable to all participants than the particular outcome they might individually prefer. The reason the Haudenosaunee Confederacy could prevent war between nations that had legitimate grievances against each other was not primarily that it had a powerful enforcement mechanism. It was that the process of consensus deliberation was so deeply embedded in the culture that people preferred working through the process to defecting from it. The leaders who were most respected were not the most forceful or the most militarily powerful. They were the most skilled at finding the path that everyone could accept. Political excellence in this system looked like something completely different from what European political culture recognized as excellence. When European traders and diplomats sat in Haudenosaunee council fires and watched the deliberative process, they were often frustrated by its slowness. They came from a political culture in which decisions were made at the top and implemented downward, and they could not understand why a system that required everyone to agree on everything was preferable to one that allowed a leader to just decide. But what they were watching, and what some of the more perceptive of them recognized, was a system that had kept nations at peace with each other for centuries. Their own systems had not managed that. Their own systems produced constant war between neighboring polities because there was no mechanism that made the process of deliberation more valuable than the outcome of winning. The political wisdom embedded in consensus governance is not archaic or inapplicable to modern conditions. It is, if anything, more applicable now than it was then, as the failures of majority-rule democracy become more apparent and the search for better mechanisms for collective decision-making becomes more urgent. What Indigenous Canadian political traditions represent is a long experiment in the alternative to winner-take-all politics. The results of that experiment, maintained over centuries, were remarkable. Number 13, the medicine traditions and the knowledge of the natural world. When European settlers arrived in North America, they brought with them the medical knowledge of 16th and 17th century Europe. That knowledge was, by modern standards, limited, and in many cases actively harmful. Bloodletting, a common European treatment for a wide range of conditions, removed the one resource the body most needed to fight infection. The miasma theory of disease, which held that illness was caused by bad air, led to treatment approaches that were largely useless and sometimes deadly. The materia medica, the collection of medicinal substances known to European medicine, was mostly effective for managing symptoms and largely unable to address the causes of disease. The Indigenous peoples of Canada had developed, over thousands of years of living in intimate relationship with the specific ecosystems of the continent, a pharmacopoeia of plant-based medicines that was in many respects more sophisticated and more effective than anything European medicine of the contact period could offer. Modern pharmaceutical research has confirmed the biological activity of dozens of plants used in indigenous medicine traditions, the anti-inflammatory properties of specific plants, the antimicrobial properties of others, the cardiovascular effects of still others, all have been documented in laboratory settings. But the medicine traditions of pre-contact Canada were not only about specific plants and specific treatments. They were embedded in a broader understanding of the relationship between human health and the health of the natural systems in which humans lived. The idea that health was not simply the absence of disease, but a dynamic balance between the individual and their environment, between the physical and the psychological and the spiritual dimensions of human experience, between the health of the individual and the health of the community, was central to indigenous healing traditions in ways that went far beyond what European medicine of any era had conceptualized. The knowledge of medicinal plants was held by specialists healers whose training required years of instruction and whose practice was embedded in ceremonial and spiritual frameworks that connected the act of healing to the larger understanding of how the world worked. This knowledge was not secret in the modern sense. It was transmitted from teacher to student across generations with great care. But it was also not freely available to anyone who wanted it, because the effective use of the knowledge required not just knowing which plants to use for which conditions, but understanding the protocols, the relationships, the responsibilities that came with being a healer. When European settlers arrived sick with diseases they had brought from Europe or contracted in the new environment, they sometimes survived because indigenous healers helped them. The use of spruce bark and needles to prevent scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency that killed enormous numbers of early European sailors and settlers, was indigenous knowledge that saved French lives on the St. Lawrence. Jacques Cartier's account of his crew being saved from scurvy by a treatment provided by indigenous healers is one of the most famous instances of this knowledge transfer, but it was one of many. Indigenous medical knowledge kept early European settlements alive in ways that European medicine could not have managed. The tragedy is that this knowledge transfer was almost entirely one-directional. Europeans took what they needed and then spent the next several centuries doing everything in their power to suppress and eliminate the very traditions that had saved them. The residential school system, among its many other devastating effects, specifically targeted the transmission of traditional knowledge, including medical knowledge. Healers were criminalized. Ceremonies were banned. The intergenerational transmission of plant knowledge, of healing protocols, of the entire framework within which indigenous medicine made sense, was systematically disrupted. What has been lost is incalculable. What survives in the memories of elders and in the communities that have maintained these traditions against enormous pressure remains extraordinarily valuable. And the modern interest in ethnobotany, in bioprospecting, in the medicinal properties of plants that have been used in indigenous traditions for centuries, is a belated recognition of what was always there. Number 14, the river highways and the canoe. The canoe is perhaps the single most significant technological achievement of pre-contact Canadian civilization, and it deserves to be understood as such. It is not a simple boat. It is not a primitive vessel. It is the product of thousands of years of iterative refinement, adapted to specific waterways and specific purposes, representing a level of engineering sophistication that allowed the peoples of the Canadian interior to do something that should have been impossible given the geography they inhabited, which was to move efficiently through a landscape that would otherwise have been nearly impassable. The Canadian Shield, the ancient bedrock that underlies most of central Canada, is characterized by thin soils, dense forest, and a hydrological system of bewildering complexity. Travel through it by land is extraordinarily difficult. The same landscape is traversed with relative ease by water, but only if you have a vessel capable of handling the range of conditions encountered along the route, from calm lakes to fast-moving rivers to sets of rapids that must be portaged around. The birch bark canoe was that vessel. The design of the birch bark canoe was not arrived at by accident or by simple intuition. It was the product of generations of observation, experimentation, and refinement. The hull form was optimized for specific types of water. Different groups developed different canoe designs for different conditions. The large freight canoes of the fur trade era, the canots du maître, were designed for the open water of the Great Lakes and the main St. Lawrence River. The smaller canots du Nord were designed for the rivers and smaller lakes of the Shield. The hunting canoes of specific northern nations were designed for the specific rivers and lakes of their particular territory. Each was a specialized tool, optimized for its specific purpose. The materials were equally carefully chosen. Birch bark was selected for its combination of lightness, flexibility, and impermeability to water. White cedar was chosen for the interior framework because it combines lightness with strength and workability. Spruce root was used as thread for seaming because it combines flexibility with durability. Pine pitch was used to waterproof the seams. Every material in the construction of a birch bark canoe was chosen because it possessed specific properties that made it optimal for that function. The construction process was a highly skilled craft that required years of training to master. The tools were simple. The knowledge required to use them effectively was not. A master canoe builder possessed knowledge of materials, design, and construction technique that had been accumulated and refined over generations, and that was transmitted through an apprenticeship system that preserved the accumulated wisdom while allowing it to continue evolving. What the canoe made possible was a continental travel network. The rivers and lakes of Canada, connected by portages at key points, formed a system of water highways that allowed experienced paddlers to travel from one end of the continent to the other. The routes were known. The portages were maintained. The knowledge of which routes to take in which seasons, which water levels were safe to navigate, which portages could be shortened by specific techniques, was encoded in the oral tradition and in the practical training of people who traveled these routes year after year. When European traders arrived and wanted to penetrate the interior, they adopted the canoe, not because they had nothing better, because there was nothing better for the purpose. European boats were useless in the Canadian interior. The canoe was the only technology that worked, and the knowledge of how to build it, how to use it, and how to navigate the continental water highway network was indigenous knowledge that Europeans depended on entirely in the early centuries of contact. Number 15. The Confederation system of the West, east of the Rockies and west of the Great Lakes, across the vast interior of what would become Canada, a different form of political organization had developed. The peoples of the Great Plains and the Parkland Belt, the ancestors of the Blackfoot, Cree, Assiniboine, Plains Ojibwe, and others, organized their political life through a system of alliances and confederations that was as sophisticated in its own terms as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in the east. The Blackfoot Confederacy, which united the Siksika, Kainai, and Piikani nations under a common political and ceremonial framework, was one of the most powerful political entities in Western North America before European contact and for a considerable time after it. At its peak, the Blackfoot Confederacy controlled a territory stretching from what is now southern Alberta into northern Montana, and its military capacity and political sophistication made it a force that European traders and settlers had to negotiate with on equal terms. The Cree, whose territory at the time of European contact extended from James Bay westward across the Canadian Shield to the foothills of the Rockies, were one of the most numerous and politically connected peoples in the interior. The Cree maintained alliance relationships with the Assiniboine to the south and trade relationships with peoples across an enormous area. Their mobility, their political flexibility, and their willingness to incorporate new technologies and trade goods into existing social frameworks made them exceptionally effective at adapting to the changing conditions that followed European contact. The alliance systems of the Western interior were not fixed political structures in the way that the Haudenosaunee Confederacy was. They were more fluid arrangements that responded to changing political and ecological conditions. Nations that were allies in one generation might be rivals in the next, and vice versa. The skills required to navigate these shifting alliances, to know when to fight and when to negotiate, whom to approach for alliance and whom to avoid, were high-value political skills that were cultivated and rewarded within these societies. The sun Dance ceremony, shared across many of the plains cultures, served among its other functions as a mechanism for renewing and strengthening alliance relationships. The gathering of multiple nations at a common ceremonial site created opportunities for the diplomatic conversations that maintained the alliance network. Marriages were arranged, trade agreements were confirmed, disputes were mediated. The ceremony was simultaneously a religious event, a social event, and a diplomatic event, embodying in a single occasion the integration of spiritual, social, and political life that characterized indigenous civilization across the continent. The horse, introduced to the plains from Spanish settlements in the south in the early 17th century, transformed the political landscape of the western interior in ways that created both opportunity and instability. Nations that acquired horses early gained significant military and economic advantages over those that acquired them later. The Blackfoot were among the early adopters and used their equestrian advantage to extend their territorial control and strengthen their confederacy. The political realignments that followed the spread of the horse across the plains were complex and consequential, and they were underway before any European had seen the western Canadian interior. Number 16, the oral tradition and the deep memory of a people. In literate cultures, history is preserved in documents. The problem with documents is that they can be lost, destroyed, or falsified. The problem with relying on documents as the primary vehicle for historical knowledge is that what gets recorded and what gets preserved is determined by those with the power to create and maintain archives. The history that survives in documents is inevitably the history of the powerful. Indigenous cultures preserved history in oral tradition. The problem with oral tradition from the perspective of Western academic disciplines is that it cannot be independently verified in the way that a document can be checked against other documents. The assumption embedded in this objection is that oral tradition is more prone to error and distortion than written tradition. But this assumption is not well supported by evidence. Oral traditions that have been compared with independently verifiable records have in many cases proven to be remarkably accurate over very long time periods. The oral traditions of coastal peoples of British Columbia contain detailed descriptions of specific geographical features, including features that are now underwater, that correspond with remarkable precision to the coastline as it existed after the end of the last ice age more than 10,000 years ago. The oral traditions of the Haudenosaunee regarding the founding of the Great Law of Peace contain astronomical references that have been used to estimate a founding date consistent with archaeological and historical evidence. The oral tradition of the Anishinaabe regarding the Great Migration describes a route that corresponds geographically to a real movement of peoples that archaeological evidence supports. This is not accidental. Oral tradition was not casual storytelling. It was a formal system of knowledge preservation with built-in mechanisms for maintaining accuracy. Stories were memorized with specific wording, not just with general content. The transmission from elder to student was a formal process that involved verification and correction. Multiple individuals in a community maintained versions of the same stories, creating a redundancy that prevented any single error from propagating through the tradition. The stories were told in ceremonial contexts that emphasized their importance and the responsibility of the teller to preserve them accurately. The oral tradition was also more than just historical record. It was a legal system. It was a philosophical framework. It was an ethical guide. It was an educational curriculum. The stories contained within them the principles of how to live, how to treat other people, how to understand the relationship between human beings and the natural world. They were not entertainment. They were the total intellectual inheritance of the community, encoded in a form that could be carried in memory and transmitted across generations without the need for external materials. When the residential school system set about destroying indigenous cultures, it recognized that the oral tradition was the key. Children were removed from their communities before the transmission of this knowledge could occur. The elders who held the most knowledge, who had been trained for years to preserve the tradition, watched as their communities were stripped of the next generation. The disruption of this transmission was deliberate and systematic. What was being targeted was not just cultural practice in a superficial sense. It was the entire knowledge system, the entire intellectual heritage of a civilization. The survival of indigenous oral tradition, despite these efforts, is a testament to the resilience of the people who maintained it. That survival required people to take enormous personal risks to continue transmitting knowledge that colonial authorities had criminalized. It required communities to find ways to preserve what they could under conditions designed to make preservation impossible. What survives is less than what existed before, but it is still extraordinary in its richness and in what it tells us about the civilizations from which it comes. Number 17, the Great Dying and the World That Was Erased. In the 1990s, a group of researchers began applying demographic modeling techniques to the question of pre-contact indigenous population in the Americas. What they found was that previous estimates, which had been based largely on the populations observed by early European settlers, were dramatically wrong. The populations observed by settlers were not original populations. They were post-catastrophe populations. The original populations were far larger. The revised estimates for pre-contact indigenous population in North America range from around 40 million on the conservative end to over 100 million according to some researchers. The current conventional estimate used by most demographers is in the range of 50 to 60 million for the continent as a whole. For what would become Canada specifically, estimates range from several 100,000 to over 2 million, with the real number probably somewhere in the middle of that range. These numbers matter for understanding what pre-contact civilization looked like. A continent with 50 or 60 million people is a very different place from a continent with a few million scattered hunter-gatherers. A continent with 50 million people is a continent with cities, with roads, with trade networks, with political systems capable of governing populations of that size, with agricultural systems capable of feeding populations of that size, with all the complexity that complexity of scale requires. The collapse of this population, the Great Dying as some historians have begun to call it, was not a single event. It was a process beginning with the first European contact on the Atlantic coast in the late 15th century and accelerating through the 16th and 17th centuries, sometimes moving faster than European settlers themselves moved. Smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, cholera, and other diseases moved through indigenous communities with speed and lethality that had no precedent in human history. Communities that had never been exposed to these diseases had no immune experience with them, and they died at rates that would be considered impossible if the historical and archaeological evidence were not so clear. The scale of death was so great that it changed the landscape. The forests of the American East and the parklands of the Canadian interior grew back over abandoned agricultural fields. The population density that had maintained specific ecological conditions through active management plummeted, and the ecosystem shifted accordingly. What Europeans later described as primeval wilderness was in many cases secondary growth on land that had been actively managed and densely populated only a few generations earlier. Charles Mann, in his book 1491, describes satellite images of the Amazon basin that show faint lines in the vegetation patterns that correspond to road networks of civilizations destroyed by disease before Europeans arrived to map them. The same kind of evidence exists in Canada in the form of archaeological sites that represent population densities far higher than anything that survived to be observed by European settlers, in the pollen records that show shifts in vegetation corresponding to the abandonment of agricultural management in the trade goods that end up in archaeological sites, far from where they were made, in patterns that only make sense if there was a much larger and more connected population to sustain them. The Great Dying was not a minor demographic event. It was the largest population collapse in recorded human history. It was comparable in its proportional impact to the Black Death in Europe, but it affected a much larger population over a much larger geographical area, and it was followed by the permanent colonization of the affected territory by the survivors of the disease source population, which meant there was no recovery of the original civilization to observe. Number 18, the knowledge of sustainable living. Before European contact, indigenous peoples of Canada had been living in the same ecosystems for thousands of years without causing the kind of ecological collapse that European-style land use produced in a matter of generations. This was not accidental. It was not because indigenous peoples lacked the technology to alter their environments significantly. They clearly did alter their environments significantly. The burning practices that maintained parkland over vast areas of the interior, the wild rice management that shaped the hydrology of specific lake systems, the fish weir systems that transformed entire river reaches, all of these represented deliberate, large-scale modification of natural systems. The difference was not between an absence of human impact and a presence of it. The difference was between impact that was sustainable over long time periods and impact that was not. The indigenous peoples of Canada had developed, through thousands of years of living with the consequences of their own resource management decisions, a sophisticated understanding of what could be taken from a natural system and what could not, of what levels of harvest were compatible with continued productivity, and what levels would cause decline. This knowledge was not expressed in the form of scientific management documents. It was expressed in stories, in ceremonies, in prohibitions and obligations, in the social structures that regulated access to resources and the cultural norms that shape behavior toward them. The concept of reciprocity, the understanding that taking from the natural world incurred an obligation to give back, that harvesting a resource without maintaining the conditions for its renewal was a form of theft from future generations, was embedded in the spiritual and philosophical frameworks of virtually every indigenous culture in Canada. The salmon management practices of Pacific Northwest peoples are perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of this knowledge. The social protocols that regulated access to salmon runs, that set limits on harvesting, that protected specific reaches of rivers as spawning habitat, that managed the timing and intensity of the harvest, represented exactly the kind of regulatory system that modern fisheries management attempts to achieve through bureaucratic means. The difference is that the indigenous system embedded the regulatory function in the social and spiritual fabric of the community, making compliance a matter of cultural identity and spiritual obligation rather than legal enforcement. Modern ecologists and conservation biologists have increasingly recognized the sophistication of indigenous land management knowledge. The concept of traditional ecological knowledge has entered the scientific literature as a serious complement to conventional scientific understanding. Research conducted in collaboration with indigenous knowledge holders has produced insights into ecosystem dynamics, species interactions, and environmental history that conventional scientific methods had failed to generate. The knowledge embedded in indigenous oral traditions and management practices represents a multi-thousand-year observational dataset that modern ecology has only barely begun to access. The irony is profound. The civilizations that European colonizers dismissed as primitive and incapable of sophisticated environmental management were in fact the practitioners of the most sophisticated and successful long-term environmental management tradition in the history of North America. The civilizations that came to replace them, with their industrialized agriculture, their extractive forestry, their drainage of wetlands and damming of rivers, produced in a few centuries an ecological crisis that indigenous management practices had avoided for millennia. Number 19. What the settlers found and what they chose not to see. History is not only what happened, it is what was recorded, and what was recorded is shaped by who was doing the recording and what they were capable of seeing. The early European accounts of pre-contact indigenous civilization in Canada are valuable precisely because they are not entirely controlled by the ideological frameworks that would later be used to dismiss what those civilizations represented. Written before the full elaboration of the racial hierarchy, theories that would dominate European thought in the 18th and 19th centuries, the earliest accounts are often more honest about what their authors actually observed than the later scholarship that processed those observations. Champlain wrote honestly about the political sophistication of the Wendat. He could not fully understand it because it operated according to principles different from anything he had encountered in European politics. But he recognized that it worked, and he respected it enough to study it carefully and to adapt his own diplomatic behavior to its requirements. The Jesuit missionaries who followed him into the interior wrote accounts that are often deeply problematic in their framing, but that contain, embedded in the polemical purpose of their writing, descriptions of social and intellectual life among the peoples they were trying to convert that reveal considerable complexity. The Jesuits, in particular, were confounded by the intellectual quality of the people they were trying to teach. They came expecting to find simple minds open to Christian instruction. What they found were people who engaged with Christian theology with sophisticated critical intelligence, who asked questions the missionaries could not answer, who pointed out inconsistencies in the Christian framework that their own spiritual traditions did not contain. The accounts of these exchanges, written for a Jesuit audience back in France, contain remarkable moments of honest acknowledgement that the missionaries had encountered not blank slates, but formed minds with their own coherent worldviews. The explorers of the interior, the men who pushed beyond the St. Lawrence into the Great Lakes and beyond, found a world that consistently refused to conform to the image of primitive wilderness they had been prepared to encounter. The trails they followed were maintained trails. The rivers they canoed were actively navigated by peoples who knew them intimately. The lands they moved through were managed landscapes. The peoples they encountered were organized, purposeful, politically sophisticated actors in a world that had been organized for a long time before Europeans arrived. Some of what they found they chose not to see. The ideological pressure to see the Americas as empty, as terra nullius, as land without owners, was enormous because it provided the legal and moral justification for colonization. If the land was truly wild and unoccupied in any meaningful sense, then occupation required no justification beyond the European power to occupy it. If the land was actually organized and inhabited by peoples with genuine claims to it, based on generations of use and management, then occupation required a different kind of justification, one that European colonial ideology was not prepared to provide. The choice not to see what was there, the choice to interpret a post-catastrophe landscape as an original landscape, the choice to describe survivors of a devastating population, collapse as if they represented the full complexity of the civilizations they had inherited, was a choice that served specific interests. It served the interests of colonial governments seeking legal cover for land appropriation. It served the interests of settlers seeking moral reassurance that they were not displacing a sophisticated civilization. It served the interest of an emerging racial ideology that needed the indigenous peoples of the Americas to be primitive in order for European civilization to be superior. The choice to see what was there, the choice that some individuals made even in the colonial period and that more people are making now, is a choice to look at the evidence honestly. And the evidence, the archaeological evidence, the historical evidence, the evidence of oral tradition, the evidence of ecological knowledge, the evidence of political philosophy, says clearly that what was here before the Europeans was a civilization. Multiple civilizations, civilizations of extraordinary diversity and remarkable achievement, civilizations that managed complex societies, produced sophisticated knowledge, organized political systems of genuine wisdom, and maintained productive relationships with the natural world for thousands of years. Number 20. The legacies alive in the land. Walk through a particular forest in the Canadian interior, and you might notice that certain trees are unusually large, unusually old, and unusually spaced. You might notice that specific plants grow together in combinations that seem too convenient to be accidental. You might notice that the terrain, the shapes of ridges and valleys and lake shores, feels in some subtle way organized, managed, purposeful. You might notice these things, or you might not, depending on whether you know what to look for. But someone trained in indigenous ecological knowledge would know. They would be reading a text written by human hands across a landscape over centuries. The legacies of pre-contact civilization in Canada are not only in museums or archaeological sites or academic papers. They are in the land itself. They are in the managed forests that were shaped by centuries of deliberate burning. They are in the plant communities that were cultivated and maintained by generations of careful tending. They are in the river systems that were modified by fish, weirs, and channels designed to enhance specific species. They are in the soil profiles that record centuries of agricultural management before European-style farming began. They are also in the living cultures of the indigenous peoples whose nations have survived the catastrophe of colonization. The languages that encode specific knowledge of specific landscapes. The ceremonies that maintain relationships with specific ecological systems. The management practices that have been adapted but not abandoned. The oral traditions that carry knowledge of what was here before and what could be here again. The political philosophy that continued to develop and adapt even under conditions designed to extinguish it. These are not relics. They are living systems. They are the continuing expressions of civilizations that were not destroyed, only severely damaged. The indigenous peoples of Canada today are not the remnants of a past that is over. They are the continuation of civilizations that have been operating on this continent for thousands of years. The interruption of colonization was devastating. The losses in population, in knowledge, in land, in political autonomy, in cultural continuity were enormous and are not over. But the civilizations did not end. They adapted, they survived. They maintained enough continuity of knowledge and practice and political organization to continue as living traditions. The totem poles of the Pacific Northwest are still being carved. The longhouses of the Haudenosaunee are still being built. The wild rice of the Anishinaabe is still being harvested in the traditional way in lakes that have been managed for that purpose for centuries. The deliberative political processes of multiple indigenous nations are still functioning. The oral traditions are still being transmitted. The ecological knowledge is still being practiced. The languages, many of them damaged by the residential school, system but not destroyed are still being spoken and are being revitalized by communities that understand their importance. The history of pre-contact Canadian civilization is not only history, it is also the context for understanding the present. The ongoing land rights disputes, the questions of treaty interpretation, the arguments about resource development on Indigenous territories, the debates about the proper relationship between Indigenous governments and the Canadian federal government, all of these are not abstract legal questions. They are the continuing working out of a collision between civilizations that began 500 years ago and has not yet found its resolution. Understanding what was here before, understanding the sophistication and the scale and the achievement of what was here before, changes how you think about all of these present-day questions. It changes the moral weight you assign to specific claims. It changes your understanding of what was lost and what responsibilities that loss creates for the present. It changes what you think is possible in terms of restoration and revitalization. Number 21, the Blackfoot winter counts and the keeping of time. Among the peoples of the Great Plains, knowledge was preserved and organized through a system of annual records called winter counts. These were pictographic records made on hides, in which each year was represented by a single image that depicted the most significant event of that year, the event by which the community would remember and name that particular year. The Blackfoot and Lakota winter counts that have survived into the modern period are among the most remarkable historical documents from the pre-contact and early contact era in North America. They are records made by the communities themselves of the events the communities considered most important in a pictographic language that was legible to everyone in the community. They are not records made by outsiders trying to document the exotic. They are internal records made by people for their own purposes. The events recorded in the winter counts span the mundane and the catastrophic, a year of remarkable cold, a year of extraordinary buffalo abundance, a year of devastating epidemic, a year of significant military victory or defeat, a year in which a particular political change occurred. Read carefully. The winter counts provide a documentary record of Plains history from the perspective of the peoples who lived it, a perspective that is almost entirely absent from the written historical record that survives. What the winter counts also reveal is a sophisticated relationship with time itself, the practice of marking the passage of time through specific events, of naming years by what happened in them, rather than by abstract numerical designations, reflects a philosophy of history in which time is made meaningful by human experience, rather than by external mathematical convention. The winter count is a record of the community's engagement with the world, a record of what the world did and what the people did in response, a record that makes the present moment the product of a continuous accumulation of specific experiences. The knowledge of how to read the winter counts, how to interpret the pictographic language and connect the images to the oral tradition that elaborated each entry, was specialized knowledge held by specific individuals within the community. These were the historians, the keepers of the collective memory. Their function was as important as that of any other specialist in the community. Without them, the record could not be read. Without the record, the community lost its connection to its own past. The winter count tradition was one of many knowledge-keeping systems that was disrupted by the combination of population collapse, forced assimilation, and the deliberate suppression of indigenous cultural practices. Some winter counts were collected by European researchers and ended up in museums and archives, where they sat for decades before anyone developed the knowledge and the methodology to read them properly. Many more were lost. The particular knowledge of reading specific counts died with specific individuals before it could be properly transmitted. The ongoing work of recovering and interpreting the winter counts that survive is part of a larger project of recovering indigenous historical knowledge that is transforming our understanding of North American history. What the winter counts reveal, when they can be read, is a history of the same events that appear in European historical records, but seen from a completely different perspective, told in a completely different voice, with a completely different set of priorities determining what was worth recording. That different perspective is not a supplement to the conventional historical record. It is a correction of it. Number 22. The architecture of the spirit world. To fully understand the civilizations of pre-contact Canada, you have to grapple with something that Western academic frameworks are ill-equipped to evaluate, which is the integration of spiritual experience and material practice that characterized indigenous life. For most indigenous cultures of the Americas, there was no sharp boundary between the material and the spiritual dimensions of existence. The world was alive. Everything in it, the animals, the plants, the rivers, the rocks, the sky, participated in a web of relationships that human beings were embedded in and responsible to. This is not a primitive belief system. It is a sophisticated philosophical framework that has implications for how human beings should behave toward their environment, toward each other, and toward the future. The obligations that flow from this framework, the obligations of reciprocity, of respect, of care for the relationships that sustain life, are not less rational than the obligations that flow from secular or other religious frameworks. They are differently rational. They emerge from a different set of foundational premises about what the world is and what human beings are. The ceremonial life of pre-contact Canadian cultures was not entertainment or superstition. It was the technology of relationship maintenance. Ceremonies were the mechanisms by which human beings renewed and repaired their relationships with the spiritual forces and natural systems they depended on. The precise repetition of ceremonial forms, the exact replication of specific songs, dances, and protocols from generation to generation was not conservatism or irrationality. It was the recognition that relationships, like all complex systems, require careful maintenance to remain functional. The sacred sites that are distributed across the Canadian landscape, the places where ceremonies were conducted, where visions were sought, where specific natural phenomena were understood to concentrate spiritual power, were not chosen arbitrarily. Many of them correspond to specific geological, hydrological, or ecological features of genuine significance. The mineral licks that attracted specific game animals, the river junctions where fish congregated, the high places from which astronomical observations could be made, the springs with specific chemical properties. The sacred geography of Indigenous Canada was, among other things, a map of ecologically significant locations encoded in spiritual terms that ensured they would be remembered, protected, and managed across generations. The vision quest, practiced in various forms across many indigenous cultures, was not a mystical retreat from the world. It was a method for accessing knowledge and establishing specific relationships with forces that could not be directly observed, but whose influence on events could be inferred. The knowledge gained through vision experience was understood as real knowledge, as information about the world that was as valid and useful as the knowledge gained through direct physical observation. The person who had undergone specific spiritual experiences and established specific spiritual relationships was a specialist, a person with access to forms of knowledge and influence that others did not have. European observers consistently failed to understand what they were seeing in indigenous ceremonial life because the categories they were using to evaluate it were not designed to recognize it. They had a category for religion, and they tried to fit what they saw into it. They had a category for magic, and they tried to fit what they saw into that. They had a category for primitive superstition, and they tried to fit what they saw into that. None of these categories were adequate because none of them captured the integration of spiritual practice with ecological knowledge, political function, and social maintenance that made indigenous ceremonial life what it was. Number 23, the question of what civilization means. At the heart of everything this script has tried to describe is a question that has not always been asked honestly in the history of the people who have come to inhabit this land. The question is, what do we mean when we use the word civilization? The conventional definition that was used to evaluate the societies of the Americas in the colonial and early modern period was a European definition. It included specific markers, writing systems, monumental architecture in stone, complex state structures with professional administrative classes, urban centers of specific size and density. By this definition, many of the most sophisticated societies in North America did not qualify as civilizations, and this non-qualification was used to justify treating their inhabitants as people without rights to the lands they occupied. The problem with this definition is that it is circular. It defines civilization in terms of the specific forms taken by European civilizations, and then uses the resulting definition to classify non-European societies as less civilized or uncivilized. It is a definition designed to produce a predetermined conclusion. A more honest question is whether the societies of pre-contact Canada demonstrated the characteristics that we actually value when we talk about civilization: the capacity to organize large numbers of people for collective purposes, to accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations, to develop ethical frameworks for governing behavior, to maintain productive relationships with the natural environment, to create art and ceremony and architecture that expressed and organized human experience, to develop political systems capable of preventing or managing conflict, to produce and distribute the material resources necessary for human flourishing. By all of these criteria, the societies of pre-contact Canada were civilizations. Extraordinarily diverse, extraordinarily well-adapted, extraordinarily sophisticated civilizations. The Haudenosaunee developed a political philosophy of consensus governance that may have shaped the constitutions of modern democracies. The Wendat built towns that surprised European observers with their size and organization. The Anishinaabe maintained a knowledge system of the Great Lakes region that was more comprehensive and more accurate than anything European cartography produced for centuries. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest created an economic system and an artistic tradition that rivaled anything the Old World had produced in comparable ecological circumstances. The peoples of the Great Plains developed a mobility-based civilization adapted to the grasslands with extraordinary skill and sophistication. None of this was primitive. None of it was simple. None of it was the absence of civilization. It was civilization in forms that European observers were not equipped to recognize, and whose non-recognition served powerful political and economic interests. The categories were not innocent. The failure to see was not accidental. It was constructed, and it has consequences that are still being worked out in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state. Number 24, the survivors and the resurgence. The story of pre-contact Canadian civilization did not end at contact. It was severely disrupted. Its population was catastrophically reduced. Its land base was systematically appropriated. Its political authority was undermined and largely replaced by colonial governance. Its knowledge systems were targeted for destruction. Its languages were suppressed. Its children were taken. Its ceremonial life was criminalized. For decades in the 20th century, the explicit policy goal of the Canadian government was to eliminate Indigenous cultures entirely and absorb their surviving members into the dominant society. That goal failed. It failed because the civilizations it targeted were more resilient than those who designed the policies imagined. It failed because people resisted. It failed because knowledge that was supposed to be destroyed was hidden and preserved. It failed because the oral traditions that were supposed to disappear were maintained in private when they could not be maintained in public. It failed because communities that were supposed to forget remembered. It failed because children who were supposed to be assimilated came home, and even without the language, even without the ceremony, even without the specific knowledge that had been taken from them, maintained enough connection to their communities to begin the work of reconstruction. The resurgence of Indigenous cultures and political movements in the late 20th century is one of the most significant developments in Canadian history. The legal recognition of Aboriginal rights in the Canadian Constitution of 1982, the Supreme Court decisions that have progressively given content to those rights over the following decades, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and its calls to action, the ongoing land rights cases that have returned specific territories to Indigenous governance, the language revitalization programs that are bringing specific languages back from the edge of extinction, the educational movements that are developing Indigenous-centered curricula. All of these represent the continuation of civilizations that colonial policy tried to extinguish. The specific forms in which these civilizations continue are not identical to the forms in which they existed before contact. Civilizations change. They adapt to new conditions. They incorporate new technologies and new ideas while maintaining continuity with what came before. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy of today is not identical to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy of 1491. The Anishinaabe communities of today are not identical to the Anishinaabe communities of 1491. They have survived 5 centuries of extraordinary pressure and emerged changed but recognizable as continuations of the civilizations they came from. The knowledge that was preserved and is now being revitalized represents a resource of enormous value, not only to Indigenous communities, but to everyone inhabiting this land. The ecological knowledge, the land management practices, the philosophical frameworks for thinking about human relationships with the natural world, these are not historical artifacts. They are living knowledge systems that address questions that modern Canadian society is still trying to answer about how to live sustainably on this land, about how to organize political systems that maintain accountability and prevent the abuse of power, about how to transmit knowledge across generations in ways that preserve its integrity. The question that the history of pre-contact Canadian civilization ultimately poses is not only about the past, it is about the present and the future. If the civilizations that occupied this land for thousands of years before European contact were as sophisticated and as successful as the evidence indicates they were, then the relationship between those civilizations and the settler society that now shares this land requires a different foundation than the one it was built on. It requires a foundation based on recognition, on respect, on honest acknowledgement of what was here before and what was done to it, and on a genuine commitment to building something better from what remains. That is a political and ethical challenge, as much as a historical one. But it begins, as all genuine political and ethical challenges do, with seeing the truth clearly. The truth is that before the Europeans there was a civilization in Canada. Several civilizations. Civilizations of extraordinary achievement and remarkable diversity. Civilizations whose knowledge still lives in this land, in its people, and in anyone willing to learn from it. That is the story that has been waiting to be told. Now you have heard it, and now you understand why some of the first people who encountered it were terrified, because it is the story of a world as complex and as human as our own, in a place where they expected to find nothing at all. If this story surprised you, if it changed how you think about this land and its history, subscribe. There is much more where this came from. The history that was hidden is deeper than any single video can contain, and every piece of it matters. Number 25. The diplomacy that held the world together. One of the most persistent myths about pre-contact indigenous North America is that it was a world of constant warfare, of tribes locked in endless violent conflict with each other, of people who lacked the political sophistication to organize anything beyond raids and revenge cycles. This myth has been used to justify colonization by suggesting that European governance brought order to a disordered world. It is almost entirely false. Before European contact, there were wars, there were raids, there were territorial conflicts, there was violence between communities and between nations. No honest account of pre-contact North America can pretend otherwise. But there was also something that gets far less attention in the conventional telling, which was diplomacy. There was a vast, complex, sophisticated world of indigenous diplomacy that maintained peace across enormous distances and between peoples with genuinely conflicting interests, and that did so not through the threat of superior force, but through the accumulated weight of protocol, relationship, and reciprocal obligation. The wampum belts of the eastern woodlands are among the most important diplomatic documents in North American history, though they are rarely described in those terms. Wampum, the white and purple cylindrical beads made from specific shells, were strung into belts in patterns that encoded specific agreements, relationships, and historical events. A wampum belt was not decorative, it was a treaty. It was a record of an agreement made between specific parties at a specific time, encoding the terms of that agreement in a visual language that both parties could read. The exchange of wampum was an act of diplomatic recognition. To receive a wampum belt from another nation was to acknowledge the agreement it recorded and to commit to maintaining the relationship it represented. To return a wampum belt was to renounce the agreement. The belts were held by specific keepers, whose responsibility was to maintain them and to recite the history they encoded at appropriate occasions, renewing the agreements they represented through periodic ceremonial reaffirmation. The two-row wampum, or cassuentha, is perhaps the most famous of these diplomatic documents. It records an agreement made between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, later understood to apply to all European nations, in the early 17th century. The belt depicts two parallel purple rows on a white background. The white background represents the river of life. One purple row represents the Haudenosaunee nation traveling in their canoe. The other represents the European nation traveling in their ship. The agreement encoded in the belt holds that the two nations will travel the river of life together, side by side, neither nation steering the other's vessel, neither nation telling the other how to govern themselves, each nation responsible for its own affairs, the relationship between them one of mutual respect and non-interference. This is a sophisticated diplomatic concept, the idea of two sovereign nations coexisting in the same territory under an agreement of mutual non-interference, each governing itself according to its own laws and customs, is not a primitive arrangement. It is a carefully thought-out framework for managing difference that has more relevance to contemporary international relations than most people recognize. The two-row wampum was not a capitulation by the Haudenosaunee. It was a diplomatic achievement. It was an assertion of sovereignty made in the form of an agreement with a foreign power. The council fire tradition, maintained at Onondaga as the symbolic center of the Haudenosaunee world, was the institutional mechanism for the kind of diplomacy that the wampum belts recorded. Representatives of the nations of the Confederacy and representatives of allied and treaty nations beyond it came to council fires to deliberate on matters of common concern. The protocols that governed these councils were elaborate and precisely maintained. Who spoke first, in what order, with what forms of acknowledgement, what gifts were exchanged, what ceremonial form structured the proceedings, all of this was carefully prescribed and carefully observed. The political relationships maintained through this system extended far beyond the Haudenosaunee Confederacy itself. The covenant chain, the alliance system that connected the Haudenosaunee to numerous other indigenous nations and to the British colonial governments, was one of the most complex political arrangements in North American history. It required constant diplomatic maintenance, regular renewal ceremonies, careful attention to the grievances and interests of all parties. It lasted for over a century and prevented wars that would otherwise have been inevitable. The peoples who conducted this diplomacy were not unsophisticated. They were professional diplomats in every meaningful sense of the word. They had learned the protocols, the languages, the histories, the specific grievances and interests of multiple nations. They had the skills to navigate extraordinarily complex political situations in which the interests of many parties had to be balanced simultaneously. They did so effectively enough to maintain peace across a significant portion of northeastern North America for extended periods. When Europeans entered this diplomatic world, they did not arrive as teachers of diplomacy. They arrived as students who were often not very good students. The diplomatic skill and the political sophistication of Haudenosaunee and other indigenous diplomats frequently exceeded that of their European counterparts. The Europeans who were most successful in navigating the indigenous political world were those who recognized this and approached indigenous diplomacy with the respect and attention it deserved. Number 26. The children of the land and the long view. There is a principle embedded in the great law of peace that has received considerable attention in recent years, not because it is exotic or ancient, but because it speaks with remarkable directness to one of the most pressing challenges of the contemporary world. The principle is this: in making decisions, the council must consider the impact of those decisions on 7 generations into the future. 7 generations. At roughly 25 years per generation, that is about 175 years. The requirement embedded in the Great Law is that before any significant decision is made, the council must consider how that decision will affect the people who will be alive more than a century and a half from now. People who are not yet born. People who cannot speak for themselves in the present deliberation. People whose interests must be represented by the people who are making decisions now. This is an extraordinary concept in any political tradition. It is an extraordinary concept in contemporary politics, where the planning horizon of most democratic governments rarely extends beyond the next election cycle, and the planning horizon of most corporations rarely extends beyond the next quarterly report. The idea that political decision-making is accountable to the distant future, that the legitimacy of a decision depends not only on its acceptability to people alive now, but on its compatibility with the welfare of people who will live 175 years from now, represents a genuinely different theory of political responsibility. It also represents a different theory of what it means to belong to a place. The peoples of pre-contact Canada did not think of themselves as temporary occupants of a landscape who were entitled to use it as they saw fit during their lifetimes, and then leave its problems to whoever came after. They thought of themselves as part of a chain of relationships, extending backward through time to their ancestors, and forward through time to their descendants. They thought of the land not as property to be owned and exploited, but as a relationship to be maintained and passed on. Their responsibility to the land was the responsibility of a trustee, not an owner. This philosophy of intergenerational responsibility and long-term stewardship is not simply a cultural preference. It is a political philosophy with specific implications for how resources are managed, how decisions are made, and how power is exercised. It is a philosophy that the civilizations of pre-contact Canada embodied in their institutions and their practices, and it is a philosophy that the world, facing the specific challenges of the 21st century, has considerable reason to take seriously. The climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the soil degradation crisis, the freshwater crisis, all of these are, at their root, the results of short-term thinking applied to long-term problems. They are the results of political and economic systems that maximize present benefit without adequate accounting for future cost. The civilizations of pre-contact Canada developed institutional mechanisms for preventing exactly this kind of short-sightedness. Those mechanisms were not perfect. No human institution is. But they embodied a wisdom about the relationship between present decision-making and future consequences that the civilizations that replaced them have notably failed to develop. The lands that the peoples of pre-contact Canada managed for thousands of years without catastrophic degradation are now subject to environmental stresses that would have been unimaginable to their original inhabitants. The salmon runs that supported Pacific Northwest civilization for millennia are in serious decline. The wild rice stands that fed the Anishinaabe for countless generations are threatened by invasive species and altered water chemistry. The boreal forest that was a managed ecosystem for thousands of years is being harvested at rates that cannot be sustained over the long term. The great animal migrations that structured life across the continental interior have been disrupted by habitat fragmentation and development. The knowledge that was used to manage these systems sustainably for thousands of years did not disappear when the civilizations that held it were disrupted. It is still there, in diminished and damaged form, in the communities and traditions that survived. The recovery of that knowledge, its application to the specific environmental challenges of the present, is not simply an act of cultural respect. It is a practical necessity for anyone serious about maintaining the ecological systems on which all life on this continent depends. The 7-generation principle is not an artifact of a dead past. It is a living challenge to the present. It asks the people who are making decisions now about this land, about its resources, about the structures of governance and economy that shape its future, to extend their view, to see not just what is convenient or profitable or politically popular today, but what will be livable and flourishing 175 years from now. That is the invitation that the civilizations of pre-contact Canada extend to everyone who now inhabits this land. It is an invitation worth accepting. Subscribe if you want to keep exploring the history that was always here but never properly told. There is no shortage of it. Every piece of this land has a story, and the people whose stories these are have been waiting a long time for the rest of us to listen. Number 27. The stone and the memory it holds. Across the Canadian landscape, there are stones that were placed by human hands in patterns that encode information. Petroglyphs carved into rock faces by people who lived thousands of years ago. Medicine wheels constructed from boulders arranged in precise geometric patterns on the prairies. Cairns marking routes and boundaries and places of spiritual significance on the Shield and in the Arctic. Pictographs painted in pigments that have lasted for millennia on the sheltered rock faces above northern lakes. These are texts. They are not always legible to people who have not learned how to read them, but they are texts nonetheless. They are records left in stone by people who understood that stone lasts longer than memory, that marking a specific place with a specific image was a way of making a claim on the future, of saying to whoever came after, we were here, and this place mattered to us, and this is what we understood about it. The petroglyphs of Peterborough in Ontario are among the most extensive in North America, carved into a limestone outcrop that the Anishinaabe call Kinomajiwapkong, the teaching rocks. They contain hundreds of images. Human figures, animals, canoes, celestial bodies, beings that are neither entirely human nor entirely animal, but something in between. The figures are not random. They are organized in spatial relationships to each other that carry meaning. They are associated with specific stories in the oral tradition that explain them. They are, to those who know how to read them, a book written in stone. The medicine wheels of the Alberta prairies are among the most mysterious and impressive achievements of pre-contact North American civilization. The Majorville Cairn and Medicine Wheel Complex in southern Alberta is estimated to be over 5,000 years old, making it older than Stonehenge. It consists of a central cairn of stones surrounded by a circular arrangement of stones with radiating lines extending outward from the center like the spokes of a wheel. The astronomical alignments of specific features of the structure correspond to specific sunrise and sunset positions at the summer solstice and to the rising positions of specific stars. Who built these structures and exactly what they were used for is a matter of ongoing research and debate. What is clear is that they were not accidental or casual. They required planning. They required astronomical knowledge precise enough to incorporate specific celestial alignments into a large-scale stone structure. They required labor to construct. They required knowledge of specific stone-moving techniques, and they were maintained and used over periods long enough that multiple generations of people contributed to their construction and continued to find them meaningful across thousands of years. The pictographs painted on rock faces above northern lakes across the Canadian Shield are perhaps the most intimate of these stone records. They are images of what the painters considered important, animals hunted or spiritually significant, spiritual beings encountered in dreams or visions, canoes and human figures in contexts that tell stories, comprehensible to those who know the background. They are painted in red, ochre mixed with animal fat, and in some cases with other pigments, using application techniques that have allowed them to survive for centuries, or in some cases millennia, on rock faces exposed to the Canadian climate. What is most remarkable about these images, read in the context of the oral traditions associated with them, is how much information they encode in a small visual space. A single image of a moose above a specific lake does not simply record the presence of moose in that area. It may record a specific hunting event, or a specific spiritual encounter, or a specific agreement about hunting rights to that lake, or a waypoint on a specific travel route. The image is a key that unlocks a story stored in memory and oral tradition. Without the key, the story may be inaccessible. Without the story, the key is incomplete. Together, they constitute a knowledge system distributed between stone and memory in a form designed to be more durable than either alone. The stones of Canada speak to those who know how to listen. They speak of civilizations that understood permanence and impermanence, that recognized the value of marking specific places with specific knowledge, that developed techniques for encoding information in durable physical form without the technology of writing in the conventional alphabetic sense. They are archives in a medium that has outlasted most of what European civilization has produced in the same territory. And they are still legible, still meaningful, still connected through living tradition to the communities whose ancestors made them. Number 28, the languages that carry a world. There are more than 60 indigenous language families in North America, representing a linguistic diversity that exceeds that of any other continent on Earth. In what would become Canada, dozens of distinct languages were spoken before European contact, representing multiple language families as different from each other as English is from Chinese. This diversity was not random. It was the linguistic signature of thousands of years of separate cultural development, of communities adapting independently to specific environments and developing distinct ways of organizing, categorizing, and describing their experience of the world. Indigenous languages are not simply different words for the same things. They encode different ways of understanding the world. The Algonquian languages that were spoken across most of eastern Canada are fundamentally different from European languages in their grammatical structure in ways that go beyond vocabulary. Algonquian languages make a fundamental distinction between things that are animate and things that are inanimate that cuts across the categories that European languages treat as obvious. Rocks in Ojibwe can be animate. Raspberry bushes are animate. The wind is animate. The category of aliveness is broader and differently bounded in these languages than in English or French. This matters for understanding these civilizations because language is not just a tool for expressing pre-existing thoughts. Language shapes thought. The categories available in a language influence what distinctions speakers of that language tend to make, what relationships they tend to notice, what aspects of experience they encode in permanent form. A language that treats rocks and wind as potentially animate has speakers who are disposed to pay attention to rocks and wind in ways that speakers of European languages are not. The Blackfoot language has a grammatical structure in which verbs are primary and nouns secondary, the opposite of European languages in which things, nouns, are grammatically primary and actions, verbs, describe what things do. In a verb-primary language, the world is understood as process, as activity, as relationship in motion, rather than as a collection of things that occasionally interact. The Blackfoot word that is often translated into English as river does not mean the same thing the English word means. It means something closer to the dynamic process of water, moving in a specific way through a specific landscape. The river is not a thing. It is something happening. These are not trivial grammatical differences. They represent different ontologies, different fundamental understandings of what the world is made of and how it works. And they have shaped how the peoples who speak these languages have understood and managed their relationships with the natural world, with each other, and with time and history. The suppression of indigenous languages through the residential school system and other colonial policies was not incidental to the project of cultural destruction. It was central to it. The architects of that system understood, even if they did not always articulate it clearly, that language is the primary vehicle for cultural transmission. Destroy the language, and you destroy the most important mechanism for passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Destroy the language, and the oral tradition that encoded thousands of years of accumulated knowledge becomes inaccessible. Destroy the language, and the specific ways of understanding the world that were developed in relationship to specific landscapes and specific ecological systems are lost along with it. The revitalization of indigenous languages in Canada today is accordingly one of the most significant cultural and intellectual developments of the early 21st century. Language immersion schools are being established. Documentation projects are recording the knowledge of fluent elders before it can be lost. Online resources and apps are making language learning more accessible to community members separated from fluent speakers. Young people who grew up without their ancestral language are learning it as adults and finding that it changes how they understand their own tradition and their own relationship to the land. Language revitalization is not nostalgia. It is not the attempt to recover a lost past. It is the recovery of cognitive tools, ways of seeing and describing and understanding the world that were developed over thousands of years and that encode knowledge, irreplaceable in any other form. Every language that is lost takes with it a unique way of being human in relationship to a specific piece of the world. Every language that is revitalized brings that way of being back into the world where it can do work again. The civilizations of pre-contact Canada were in significant part made of language. Their knowledge was carried in language. Their governance was conducted through language. Their relationships with each other and with the natural world were mediated and maintained through language. To understand those civilizations and to continue the living traditions that descended from them, the languages that those civilizations made and that those civilizations are partly made of must be maintained, recovered, and spoken. If this history changed something in how you see this land and the people who shaped it long before Canada was a word, subscribe. The full story of these civilizations is still being recovered, still being told, and every chapter of it deserves to be heard.